notes. Can I get some water, please? Yes, it's always fun when you put us as the last speaker at a conference. It's either God's divine mercy or a beginning of a good joke. So I think I'm about the only person that has two nationalities on their badge. I also think that's a good joke. It is a good joke because Nigeria and Norway are the opposites. But it reminds us of God's grace and mercy. And in many ways, my experience, and it's not only a Nigerian, but another Nigerian, has shaped my concept of hope. If you don't know anything about northern Nigeria, you should go and read about it. It's one of the most dangerous places for Christians to be because of religious persecution. So with my travels, my work as a community developer, my experience as a northern Nigerian, and the reality of my place as God's child, these are the frameworks and the lenses through which I'm looking at this topic. So Hope That Defies is the title, Envisioning a Redeemed World. And by the way, Professor Jennings took all my notes, so where is he at? All right, let's dive into it. From fragmentation to fire. On October 7th, 2023, as violence erupted anew between Israel and Gaza, its repercussions were felt well beyond the Middle East. I think many of us remember that event. In cities across Europe and North America, thousands took to the streets, some waving Israeli flags and others marching under the banner of Palestinian liberation. In universities, tensions ran high. One campus had a student group organize a vigil for the victims in Gaza, drawing hundreds. The following day, another group held a rally in support of Israel's right to defend itself. Posters were turned down, accusations of hate and insensitivity flew back and forth, and friendships unraveled over social media posts. Professors struggled to teach in classrooms while walking a tightrope. Some were accused of being too neutral, while others were accused of taking sides. Alumni pooled funding. Boards issued careful worded statements with each word weighed, criticized, and dissected by the public. What was once a distant conflict had arrived in intimate spaces. Dorm rooms, dining tables, places of worship were not excluded. People weren't just reacting to the events overseas, but to one another. It became a test of identity and belonging and loyalty at home, an event that happened far in a country far distant from theirs. Some choose to listen and learn in the face of sorrow and anger. Others fell back to absolute certainty, and many more stayed silent, unsure on how to speak in a world where every word seemed to be carrying the weight of judgment. Beneath this is a political division, one that is deep, and it shows a shared desire or shared search for moral direction. Roger Speeds captures this underlying tension when he observes that society is on the road to the paradox of polarization and uniformity. Hashtags like roads must fall, Black Lives Matter, and Make America Great Again, along with other ongoing struggles over identity, reflect the depth of this division. In many democratic contexts, it can sometimes feel like partisan loyalty overshadows a commitment to democratic values. As Milan W. Svolik puts it, this is when ordinary people become pro or anti-Chavez, Orban, Erdogan first, and Democrats only second. These patterns point to ideological rifts and the slow erosion of a shared narrative, one capable of renewing a sense of collective purpose and rebuilding trust in our common institutions. Against this backdrop, one might naturally hold to hope. Defined in its simplest term, as Emma Pledgen and her colleagues put it, a desire combined with a belief about the possibility of attaining this desire. However, if hope were truly that simple, we wouldn't find ourselves turning to it with such urgency. The hope we need must arise above mere sentiment. In an increasingly divided world, it must transform into a form of social engagement, a deliberate act of defiance against despair. If the night of polarization persists, we as a people must find a hope whose fire light in defiance of the shadows of hopelessness. But to kindle such a fire, we must first name the forces that extinguish it. This means we must confront polarization not simply as a political crisis, of which it is, but also as a profoundly theological one, an ailment that fractures societies and souls. So how do we do this? Well, beneath the visible cracks that I've described in our public debate, what might best be described as cultural or moral disintegration is the reality of a deterioration of social trust in our political discourse. And not only that, our communities have been held down by its rifts, and particularly historical wounds that are basically escalating this ideological antagonism. At least it seems so. Democracies today face more than just institutional dysfunction. They are experiencing affective breakdowns, where it looks like ordinary people become pro this or pro that, or anti this or anti that first, before they become humans second, just paraphrasing Slovic. If this is true, then this division has become a defining characteristic of modern social political life. Andreas Schedler notes that such an effective polarization transforms disagreement into existential suspicion. We no longer argue policies. We deny the moral credibility of those who dissent. This transformation cultivates avoidance, reinforces intolerance, and sometimes legitimizes political violence. We observe that polarization is also within the church, something that is obviously a mirroring of what is happening in society, and sometimes it even intensifies broader societal divisions, exposing profoundly moral, theological, and communal fractures. It is often demonstrated in how members rule out any form of compromise and shut down the desire to communicate. Rather than being recognized solely as God's people, theological distinctions emerging between conservative and liberal, evangelical and ecumenical, pro and anti-same-sex relationships emerge. This dynamic is charged with conflicts, wherein Christians tend to define themselves in opposition to other Christians, reinforcing us versus them mentality within the body of Christ. Amanda Henderson provides an example of how political polarization and Christian nationalist impulses within mainline Christian churches impact congregational leadership, resulting in heightened internal conflict and fragmentation. Among other impacts, this theological polarization affects clergy's well-being and leads many people, many pastors, many church leaders to consider leaving ministry altogether. Instead of witnessing the shalom peace of God that creates life, people are left spiritually wounded, and the church becomes a bearer of despair in this regard. So why should we be surprised when the body breaks down and the church splinters along the same fault lines that fractures the world outside its walls? Well, borrowing the language of American politics, Peter Voss describes how the fragmentation runs deep, compounded by the fading of what he calls purple churches, spaces where ideological differences were once shared in the same pew. Instead, we see the rise of sanctuaries tinted red and blue, again, reference to American politics, echoing not heaven, but Washington. Voss names the danger, the rise of political homogeneous churches. He warns us with unsettling clarity, our theological understanding is perverted. When we speak in the dialect of division, that is. We become what we oppose, entangled in the dualisms we long to oppose. And so the question haunts us, not just how to name this unraveling, but how to live through it, How do we remain faithful when the structures that binds us pulls us apart? This leads to the next, reclaiming hope. This prompts a crucial question. What type of hope can sustain us amid these fragmented realities in the West and also beyond? Perhaps we should start by asking the question, what is hope? This seemingly straightforward question initiates a philosophical and existential exploration of how human beings maintain meaning in the face of fragmentation and hopelessness. The multifaceted perspective from different disciplines can help highlight a key point of this lecture, namely, the assumption that hope, when truly grasped, transcends mere feeling to become a bold act that defies theological despair. Michael Malone proposes this perspective on hope, suggesting that it consists not just on belief and desire, but a non-didactic, perpetual-like experience of reasons to promote the object of one's desire. This is to say that hope transcends belief and intellectual agreement, serving as a felt orientation towards the good, even in the face of uncertainty. Catherine Roy emphasizes that such a hope fuels a motivation in the face of challenges, but must be navigated carefully to avoid detachment from reality. Hope is not naive optimism, but a disciplined posture, and Professor Jennings mentioned that yesterday, that sees possibility amid hardship. Here, Thomas Aquinas calls it a movement or a stretching forth of the appetite towards the supreme but arduous good, namely eternal happiness found in the divine. For Aquinas, hope is not grounded in human capacity, but leans on God's help to attain what is otherwise unreachable. This leaning implies relational trust, a second-person engagement with the divine as co-attending subject. In a world increasingly defined by despair from polarization and existential threat, hope acts as a general orientation or a sense of how things are with the world, transforming despair into a resilient movement. From an alternative perspective, perhaps a psychological one, hope transcends mere optimism. It serves as a subversive force that disrupts the grip of emotional absolutism, which frequently drives and exacerbates polarization. While polarized societies tend to provoke responses of fear, anger, and apathy, each a fixed emotional posture, hope creates the psychological space for adaptive agency and moral imagination. As Della Mosley and her colleagues put it, radical hope allows for a sense of agency to change things for the greater good. This capacity challenges emotional closure, but offering a reason to act without certainty of success. As already implied, hope as collective memory and shared purpose subverts individualistic logic, forging solidarities that resist the divisive narratives of tribalism and ideological purity. In contrast to the paralysis of polarization, which breeds either cynical disengagement or combative extremism, hope from a psychological perspective fosters resilience, humility, and a shared moral vision. By doing so, it insists on meaningful participation and replaces rigid emotional binaries with complex affective registers: courage, longing, grief, anticipation. Thus, in fragmented societies, hope is not a naive sentiment but a psychological revolution. It reclaims the right to imagine and pursue a life beyond the constraints of antagonism, uniting people in the shared labor of meaning-making and healing. Theologically, hope confronts polarization not by retreating into neutrality, but by refusing to let ultimate meaning be determined by ideological allegiances or reduced to social utility. In the words of Aquinas again, hope orients us towards a future good, possible but arduous to attain, and is grounded not in present consensus, but in divine promise. It is, as David Eliot reminds us, the virtue that answers to St. Augustine's famous phrase, "You have made us for yourself," and thus locates human longing with a teleological framework that resists both utopianism and despair. This kind of hope does not pacify differences. Rather, it shapes them, channeling temporal passions not towards lasting objectives. Instead of erasing disagreement, it might even heighten it, since it neither glorifies the present nor vilifies the other. As Eliot states, hope is a firm disposition that enables one to desire and trust in what God alone can fulfill. This theological perspective reframes our anxiety not by dismissing their validity, but by displacing their ultimate significance. It liberates us from the responsibility of treating political identities as sacred while grounding us in a transcendent promise that cannot be reduced to partisan narratives. As such, hope must be understood not as a soothing balm or oil, but as a radical vision that sustains us from the sloth and despair that threaten amid injustice, tragedy, and death. It is both comfortable and confrontational. Comfort because it assures us of grace. Confrontational because it calls us to live in tension with the world's false eschatologies. This is not vague optimism, but a theological fire. One that may warm our hearts to one another or leave us divided. We've got to choose. Polarization views radicality as a condition of constant vigilance, caught in a loop of fatigue and heightened awareness. However, amidst this turmoil, hope resides in finding a tranquility that transcends situation, soothes the spirit, and quiets the mind even in the face of chaos. This peace is not the fruit of denial or escape, but of a hope that anchors itself in divine faithfulness. Such hope does not eliminate suffering, but transfigures it. It turns despair into endurance and chaos into communion, precisely because it leans not on human strength, but on the quiet assurance that God is at work, even in the dark. Villas-Boas makes this distinction clear. Such a hope, espérance, belongs to the order of transcendence, where salvation is possible beyond the often adverse constraints of life. True hope does not reside in the resolving of every political conflict or papering over the wounds of injustice inflicted on individuals or communities. Instead, it takes root in humility and seeks to bear witness in a deeper assurance grounded in the triune God's redemptive work. In doing so, it quietly subverts the absolutism of polarization by creating space for both lament and patience. It resists the temptation to sanctify the present moment or vilify those who differ, because it discerns all time and every person under the sovereign care of God who redeems. This posture neither rushes to closure nor yields to despair. Instead, it inhabits the in-between with a faithful attentiveness that is both truthful and tender. This ethic is not merely countercultural. It is a theological refusal to let sin and division define the limits of Christian witness. When hope in the theological sense shapes ecclesial communities, it becomes a visible protest against the despair and rage that polarization breeds. In a world trained to choose sides, the church is called to embody a different kind of belonging. One that makes room for lament, as I mentioned, patience and prophetic action. Hope ordains earthly goods to our eschatological end, writes Eliot. And this reorientation allows Christians to act with resilience and vitality that transcends widespread cynicism. Philosophically, this offers a counter-narrative to polarization by reflecting or rejecting the false dichotomy between quietism or activism. It provides an endurance that flows not from ideological certainty, but from what Eliot calls it, the youthfulness of the spirit, which curbs demoralization when the result of our endeavors prove flawed. This hope allows the church to become what James McClendon describes as a contrast society, marked by practices that reject the logic of fear, control, and division. Yet such a witness requires clarity about the nature of hope itself. As Boas warns, to collapse hope, espérance, meaning specific, strong, almost certain expectation or hope rooted in faith and a strong belief, into a hope, espoir, a wish or an anticipation for something positive to happen. To do this is to confuse divine promise within human projection, leading inevitably to despair when outcomes disappoint. True hope is anchored in God's faithfulness, not in strategic success or cultural acceptance. This liberates communities to live vulnerably and boldly, bearing witness to what Eliot calls a foretaste of a redeemed humanity. In an age of ideological exhaustion, I think many of us can attest to that, such hope does not escape the world's pain, but speaks into it. So, in such world facing this threat that I've painted and described, radical perspectives on hope aren't merely optimism. They often emerge from suffering and struggle. And this is exemplified in the historical legacy of the Anabaptists, whose origin provide a powerful illustration of hope shaped by adversity. So, Anabaptist roots. How does this issue of radical and defiant hope relate to the story of Anabaptists? Their stories serve as a guide of an inspiration, at least to me, showcasing the enduring power of hope. The Anabaptist movement emerged during one of the most uproarious periods of European history, the 16th century Reformation. In its earlier stage, Anabaptists rose from the break with the mainstream Swiss reformers. Students of Ulrich Zwingli, like Konrad Grebel and Felix Manz, grew disillusioned with Zwingli's willingness to partner with political authorities to achieve reform. They believe instead that the progress and the completion of the Reformation ought to be directed by the churches and not by government. They oppose any church strategy linked to the coercive force of the state. In 1525, they put their beliefs into action by performing believers' baptism, an audacious act that confronted both church and empire. This pivotal movement or moment established the Anabaptist testimony as one that denounces oppression in favor of voluntary and covenantal pledge. It is crucial to understand that Anabaptist emphasis on believers' baptism, nonviolence, and separation from worldly politics and government did not arise in isolation. It developed in a context of polarization, persecution, and theological divides. Theirs was not a movement born of tranquility, but turbulence, or of turbulence defiance. In a culture dominated by religious alliances with empire, the Anabaptists insisted on another way, one marked not by triumph, but by testimony, not by cultural conquest, but by cruciform faithfulness. The story of Dirk Willems shines like a quiet defiance. In 1569, Willems, a Dutch Anabaptist imprisoned for his faith, escaped and ran across the frozen pond. When his pursuer fell through the ice, Willems turned back and saved him, only to be recaptured and burned at stake. This image of Dirk Willems extending his arms to the desperate man in the frozen pond has become perhaps the most enduring image within Mennonite tradition of what it means to follow Christ, no matter what the cost. Kevin Ence Rimple describes. His action was driven not by strategy, but by commitment to a radical lifestyle defined by a bold hope that persists even amid uncertainty. He broke the logic of polarization not by outmaneuvering his enemy, but by loving him. Willems revealed the kingdom already present in a single moment of redemptive fidelity. It was not simply altruistic, but a hopeful rebellion against a world shaped by vengeance and domination. This way of living contrasts with the logic of conquest that often shapes the church and society. In a world driven by domination, the church is called, as my Dr. Father Henk said to us 5 weeks ago, to be a contrasting community, formed not by power, but by promise, not by victory, but by costly faithfulness. Covenant, not conquest. This isn't to suggest that all Anabaptists were like Willems. Certainly, the events of Munster Rebellion highlights this. However, the contrast between Willems and Thomas Munster is not incidental. It reveals two theological paths in response to crisis. Munster believed the kingdom of God could be realized through radical revolution and was described as a proto-communist of his age, who used biblical texts to justify a real communist order, similar to Marxian classless society. His apocalyptic rhetoric fueled the Peasant War, where thousands rose up against feudal oppression only to be crushed. Munster's failure was not merely military, it was theological. By cloaking conquest in divine language, he betrayed the cruciform shape of Christian hope. It was a vision without mercy, without patience, without enemy love. However, while Munster's vision utilized apocalyptic rhetoric for political power, Williams witnessed hope as a form of cruciform fidelity, a subversive journey defined by triumph, not by triumph, but by redemptive love. Williams also modeled a politics of covenant. His choice was not passive resignation, but a decisive act of resistance to hatred, retaliation, and fear. As Menno Simmons later wrote, true Christians do not know vengeance. They are the children of peace. Their hearts overflow with peace. Their mouths speak peace, and they walk in the way of peace. The theology behind this claim is not abstract. It is grounded in martyrdom, in communal sharing, and in an unwavering commitment to Christ's way. As John Roth and Steve Nolt summarize, Anabaptists believe that Christians, empowered by the Holy Spirit, will witness to the transformative power of Christ's love, even to enemies. The Anabaptist vision of hope is thus a direct theological and ethical critique of polarization by rejecting the logics that sustain it: domination, ideological absolutism, and relational fragmentation. Identity is often forged in opposition in polarized societies, and communities are maintained through exclusion. Anabaptist ecclesiology or theology, despite the notion of the concept of the ban, subverts this by emphasizing community based on reconciliation, covenant, and discipleship rather than by coercion. This way of living exists not in an idealized realm, but in the messy in-between of broken world and a promised future. Here, hope must take flesh in daily practices. Embodied acts that witness another way of being that operates outside the dichotomy of pro-this or anti-that that is prevalent in our world. Living in the in-between. Speaking of hope embodied, acknowledges that hope in its transformative form is a practice, a way of living that embodies the future we desire. With this radical commitment to community, peace, and discipleship, the Anabaptist tradition has long insisted that Christian faith must take flesh in ordinary life. This means that theology is not fully real unless enacted in embodied relationships. In this sense, Anabaptist theology presents not just a moral proposal, but an incarnational ethic to faithfully inhabit the spaces between crucifixion and resurrection, between the Good Friday and the resurrected Easter Sunday. A place where we grieve what has been lost and dare to hope for resurrection, not only in the story of Jesus' resurrection, but in the circumstances we find ourselves in. As I have suggested throughout this speech, this lecture, while polarization thrives on the need to be right, Anabaptist theology promotes a different approach, as captured in the words of Menno Simmons again. True evangelical faith serves those that harm it. It binds up that which is wounded. This stance is neither one of triumphalism or victimhood. Rather, it is a gentle prophetic determination to proclaim a stronger hope than fear. Such a proclamation must also be embodied, spoken, and actively demonstrated in our actions. Anabaptist hope is not enforced through doctrinal coercion, but embodied in, as Kirk McGregor explains, eaten with banned church members as an imitation of Christ's mercy, sustained by a Christocentric outlook on Scripture, which provides it as the principle of Anabaptist hermeneutic. The church becomes, in this light, not a fortress against the world, but a porous, spirit-shaped body witnessing to an alternative way of life. Danny Weaver describes this as the community that lives by the narrative of Jesus. This community, he argues, is not marked by abstract belief, but by practices that mirror Jesus' life, crossing boundaries, resisting domination, and extending grace to outsiders. Living with hope, then, means creating communities that make forgiveness and reconciliation possible. This is not naive but costly grace. It requires structures of accountability, compassion practices, and empathy habits. It calls us to remember that even those with whom we disagree, politically, religiously, and culturally, etc., are made in the image of God. In times of violent polarization, this is an act of spiritual defiance. It is the refusal to reduce people to categories and enemies. This hope does not bypass struggle or silent protest. Instead, it transfigures resistance through a cruciform lens, grounding justice in reconciliation and protest in communion. Anchored in the theology of non-resistance, Anabaptist traditions bears a witness to a long-standing refusal of enemy-making as antithetical to the gospel. Even amid the moral and theological complexities surrounding his legacy, John Howard Yoder reminds us that the church is summoned to be a new society, people. A community in which the cross, not coercive power, becomes the locus of reconciliation and the healings of divisions. This vocation does not entail the aversion of conflict. Rather, it calls the church into a cruciform mode of engagement, shaped again by patience, vulnerability, and the shared work of discernment. But such hope must ultimately do more than resist the present. It must point beyond it. True radical renewal does not emerge from nostalgia or naive optimism. It breaks in us eschatological witness, unveiling the false powers of age and testifying to the coming of a new heaven and a new earth. Lastly, radical renewal reimagined. In conclusion, to speak of hope today is to rebel against resignation. In a world where polarization feeds on fear and where identity is often weaponized, the decision to hope, to live, organize, believe as if reconciliation is still possible, represents nothing less than a subversive act. From Derek Williams' defiance to the communal ethic of the gathered church, we have seen how hope resists ideological despair and spiritual resignation. The Anabaptist story and tradition invites us into this rebellion, not through grand gestures, but through humble faithfulness, building communities of grace, welcoming the stranger, and refusing to return violence for violence. It is a way of life that refuses, again, both nostalgia and hopelessness. It names the fractures of our time honestly: racism, colonial legacy, ecclesial complicity, ideological rage, but does not allow these classifications to have the final word. It insists that the story of Jesus is still unfolding and that our witness matters. If we were Pentecostals, we would say amen here, but we are not. In this light, hope is not a retreat from reality, but a confrontation with it, infused with a profound loyalty to the common kingdom. It is a hope that embraces crucifixion without giving up on resurrection. Such hope equips the church to embody a different future even now. Not a perfect community, but a truthful one. Not a triumphant body, but a faithful one. Not a church of conquest, but of covenant. This is not a hope grounded in outcomes, but in the God who raised Jesus from the dead. In such faith, we rebel not with swords, but with scars, shaped by covenant and sustained by grace. This is our calling in a burning world, to choose light, not because we deny the darkness, but because we dare to believe it will not win. Hope is rebellion, and love is a strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think this was very inspiring, and I think it provided a lot of food for thought, but hopefully not only for thought, not only for our brains, but also an inspiration for action, for living that is reinforced and inspired by this kind of hope. But I believe that you all have, or at least many of you have, some questions to clarify or to expand what we've just heard. So I think we still have enough time to do just that. So perhaps we can open the floor, and if you have a question or comment, please feel free to raise your hand, and I hope we do have microphones around. Yes, we do. Great. There you go.
Lydia Penner from the Netherlands. I'm Lydia Penner from the Netherlands, and I could affirm everything, more or less everything you said, except I want to comment on the word polarization. When it first came into the public conversation, I felt rebellion, because I don't see that. We have far more in common with other people than differences. In the first place, we're all human beings. And in the second place, if you look at politicians, if you talk to them long enough, what they really want is the good of the whole society. Even people that we might think are thinking of themselves, like Trump and Putin, they're human beings like the rest of us. And so whenever I hear the word, I want to think about, I try to think about what I have in common. So my question is, do you think that's sticking my head in the sand?
Surely not. I share a bit of your sentiment that throughout this lecture, my hope is that we will find a third way, and that way will be that we find that which is in common, that we have in common, so that hope triumphs over despair. But the reality is that we can talk about this as much as we would like to, unless it is enacted, that someone leads the way, that shows that indeed we can have a lot more in common than that which separates us. It will not happen, and off by itself. So what we need, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, is role models that lead the way and show us how this is done. If not, the result would be indeed people divided, which is what I see in my community, in my society in Norway, and perhaps in other places. So we need people, in order to avoid sticking our heads in the sand, we need people who will lead the way and show that there's a third way, rather than pro and against, that we can actually pursue the common good together.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for your lecture. I need to also go into the polarization, but maybe differently. I agreed with so much of what you were saying, and at the same time, I do think there's a conflict. I do think that there's struggle, and that is part of the biblical narrative. There is a struggle. It's not against flesh and blood. It's against powers and principalities. But those powers and principalities possess people. So I wonder if we can have a critique of polarization or a love of enemies that acknowledges that we have enemies, that there are people acting against the common good, and maybe it doesn't make sense because we have more in common, but they don't treat the world like that. And where there is a necessity to struggle and to curtail people's power, to destroy our common home. So, like, it feels a little bit like what you're saying is polarization itself is the problem. We just need to create places where, like, people come together, and it's in the end a misunderstanding. Are there real conflicts where the gospel is on a side, where Jesus takes a side, to quote a book from an Anabaptist preacher?
Yes, then perhaps you might have misunderstood me. Polarization is not a problem, a lack of hope is. And this is the point of this lecture. Polarization is basically the symptom of the problem, not the real problem. We live in a time that we indeed need hope, and Professor Jennings gave us a remarkable lecture yesterday as part of a reminder. But that hope cannot be one that is just intellectual. It is not enough. It has to be one that is embodied, that it's got a name, a personality, and it's moving around, and it's impacting and changing lives. And I'll just give you a quick example. So I don't know if you know, Norwegians don't look like me. Yes, I know. And I do call myself a dark-skinned Viking just to blend in. Migrants across Europe, and this is, I'm speaking into the European context. In many ways, many people experience this hopelessness. But I don't want that to have the last word. I want Christ to have the last word. And so we need a kind of hope, and I'm getting a bit emotional now, but we need a kind of hope that transcends the categories that we create for others. And although it seems sometimes so innocent, it is life-taking. And we need the shalom peace of God that breathes life, that speaks of a hope, that shows you a future, a common future, where your enemy is also involved in.
I'm Liz Ullery Swenson from United States, Seattle, Washington area. Also come from Vikings,
Yes.
but by marriage, not by, not by honesty. I am speaking into the conversation between the church at large and church as institutions, and ask the question of to whom are we asking to be patient, and to whom and for how long are we asking them to be patient? When we see many institutions refusing to see the humanity of people, what is the cost to those individuals to maintain patience for the sake of this perceived hope in peace and unity? And then I also sort of within that framework mentioned that the Anabaptists did not remain patient. They did leave. They did break off from what was the unified church. And so I think in a sense we are asked to find a third way, and perhaps sometimes leaving, not being patient, fighting for equality amongst division is in fact the third way. But I see many denominations, in particular, I come from the Church of the Brethren denomination in the United States. And we are very divided, and we're asked to maintain a sense of peace for the neutrality and comfort of those who do not see my humanity, and I'll stop there.
So let me answer your question with a story. It's very personal to me. In 2017, my cousin, who was 17 at that time in northern Nigeria, in Kaduna, was slaughtered by Muslims. Yes. And I called my aunt, and I was mad. And this were her words. Sorry, I'm going to tear up. She said, "Let us pray for them who killed my daughter." That was her second child that she had lost. We in the West, we have a problem. We think that everything has to go on our own clock. I don't know your context well. I've been to the States, but I think that God's timing is not often my time. But sometimes such courage like that of my aunt reminds me that there is a God. She said to me, I called her mad, and she said, "Pray for them." Pray for them were her words. That is that kind of hope that I desperately need.
Gabriel, thank you so much for this presentation. You so well described kind of two approaches, Thomas Müntzer approach and Dirk Willems approach. My question is, if we put this into present-day context in Ukraine, for example, then so many men who are fighting on front line are signs and embodiment of hope for this nation. And they seem to present much more Thomas Müntzer approach than Dirk Willems approach. My question actually is, in the light of what is going in Ukraine, for example, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, do we need to reconsider our theology and our understanding of hope? Maybe we do not have enough time here for that, but can you comment a little bit on this question?
Yeah, I was going to say I was going to write it in my next book. I haven't written any book yet, so. I sometimes wonder if I am a part-time or full-time pacifist. I really do. I've struggled with that. But just to comment on that, you and I have a common friend, Fyodor. He doesn't carry weapons. He carries the good news. He visits people with the love of God. And stories like his are not told often in the midst of war. But you know what? The people like Theodore that hold the fabric of societies from falling apart. Not just the weapons in the war front. Yes, protecting your country. You know, I don't know what to say to that, but I think that there's room for that, and I'm still trying to figure out. But I want to focus on people like Fyodor that are serving people who are desperate. And their stories need to come more to the light because their way of fighting this war by rehumanizing the people whose humanity has been attempted to be taken away is the third way that I want to embody.
Muchas gracias, Gabriel. Elizabeth Soto, Puerto Rico, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In the feminist perspective, I feel I'm struggling with the crucifor of proposal that you're bringing about that keeps me into suffering. I wonder if there's other images, even the feminist theology, that could present us other images more than just the cross. And that where is the prophetic voice when we say, no más, se acabó, this is wrong. So I find myself on the other side in more and more understanding those in the Munster fighting. They got killed. But the other brother that rescued the enemy got killed too. So whatever we do, we will get killed. But to be killed for the right cause, maybe it be. But I do not want to hold on in a theology of suffering when there's a prophetical voice to say no más, in which I put my body and my soul into la causa de Cristo. So I found myself struggling on the concept, dear brother, in which I think we hold on too much to the cross that bears testimony that something was wrong that killed Jesus. So I'm struggling in that. I don't know if you understand what I'm
Yes.
trying to say.
Yeah.
But I'm holding hope,
Yes.
¿sí? La esperanza, ¿sí? En español, donde viene la palabra, ¿sí? Gracias.
Thank you. Struggle is good in my head. It exercises my muscles, my spiritual, and perhaps even character. McClendon calls theology struggle. I have no right to tell anyone how much they should suffer. They should look to Christ to find how much they should suffer and when is enough. But what I can tell you is that I want to situate myself between the story of the Good Friday and the Easter Sunday, where my suffering is not in vain, where victory, and I know, is 100% assured in Christ. Yes, Münzer died and Dirk Williams died. But I think the testimony of the loving your enemy that Dirk Williams embodied speaks into our lives in a different way. And I want to explore that.
One more question.
It's coming. So, Gabriel, I have a former colleague who, a Quaker, who studied alongside people involved in the civil rights movement in the US, and he loved to agitate churches. In particular, he was a Quaker himself, but he loved to agitate them too. But he used to talk about it's not hope that leads to action on social justice, but action leads to hope. So when you're trying to act in the world as it is, not in the world in which it should be, it's action that leads to hope, not hope that leads to action. And I wondered how you would respond to that.
I'll say it's both, but I think it starts, each action starts from the place of hope, and I did define hope as not being certain about the outcome. And so the starting point being hope, one that is not certain about the outcome, but one leaning, as Thomas Aquinas says, leaning into God, would change, would configure your action in many ways. I wonder, if I'm allowed to say this, I wonder if your starting point is there, if it's going to actually humanize you as a person involved in the process, which then translates to humanizing your opponents, so to say. As I mentioned here, Anabaptists were preoccupied with the idea of, how would you say it? They were preoccupied with the idea of recognizing the image of God, it seemed to me so, in their enemies. And I think Mandela is a good example of that. How would you, after being imprisoned by a group of people, when you became president, you made them your bodyguards? Or it could be one of two things. That he really understood it, or he wanted to allow them to have a taste of hell on earth. One of the two.
I'm aware we probably have more questions, but as always, you can approach Gabriel for next half an hour, provided you have checked out of your rooms, of course, provided that you've done that. So at this point, let's give thanks to Gabriel.